Well, Aberdeen employ a bottom-up fundamental research policy. That means that we go out and visit companies on the ground actively, and we spend the bulk of our time travelling to emerging markets to meet with a broad universe of companies. In the small cap universe, there's thousands of companies, which means that having a large team is very important, and we have about 36 fund managers working in emerging markets who visit these companies actively, write research on them, and that allows us to take active stock decisions, and as a result of that we tend to be quite a long way from the benchmark. So we tend to add value through stock selection, and that bottom-up fundamental process tends to have served us quite well over the longer term. We like companies which are prudently managed, so that means either from a business perspective, they tend to have good long-term and sustainable growth profiles. From a balance sheet perspective, they tend to be prudently managed, so that means they either have net cash or they have a strong balance sheet with good cash flows backing that up. And we also like companies which are managed by people who we think we can trust. So that means that the corporate governance standards are high, we tend to have boards of directors which are independent, and we like to see representation of minority interests within the company. So that tends to be the kinds of business that we look for. Well, I hesitate to say that it's challenging for minority shareholders no matter where you're based. And absolutely right to say that in emerging markets, corporate governance over the years hasn't been as good in some places as it has been in others. And certainly in places in Latin America, for example, in Brazil, there's been big steps made to try and improve corporate governance, whether that's the election of independent boards, the unification of share classes, or indeed the production of IFRS or US GAAP accounts. That's the kinds of things which people are moving towards. And it's been an important change, in fact, because people have recognised that adopting good corporate governance standards actually leads to a higher share price in the longer term. And I think people are beginning to embrace corporate governance from that perspective, really across emerging markets, but with a few pockets of exceptions, of course. Well, for our portfolio, the emerging markets small cap portfolio, we have a fairly strong and robust earnings growth profile. We're looking for around about 8 to 10% earnings growth for the next 2-3 years, and we think that's pretty conservative in what we're looking for. The kinds of companies that we invest in tend to be towards the less cyclical end of things, so global growth worries tend to perhaps impact our companies less than they might do the more cyclical, high beta, export orientated businesses, and we tend to be more in favour of domestically orientated consumer businesses in emerging markets. Well, there's no doubt that deleveraging in the West has to occur, and that will have an impact on global growth. And markets have really begun to price that in the last few months. So that deleveraging will have an impact on growth in emerging markets as well as developed markets. But we still feel confident that emerging market economies can grow at a meaningfully faster pace than developed market economies. There are tools available to monetary policymakers, including reducing interest rates, increasing liquidity, increasing infrastructure spending. These kinds of things are still available to emerging market policymakers, whereas in the West they perhaps aren't available to policymakers here. And so from that perspective, we feel quite confident that the economies can continue to grow at a fast and relatively healthy pace in the coming years. But perhaps it won't be as fast as it was in the period from around 2003 to 2007. When we saw a real boom time in many Asian and many Latin American economies. But we still feel confident that the growth is going to be meaningfully above that of developed markets.